The Superior Court of Sacramento, California, was unusually crowded on the morning of a highly publicized corruption trial. Attorneys hurried through the hallways carrying stacks of documents while reporters filled every seat in the courtroom, waiting for the proceedings to begin. Near the back row, away from the cameras, sat an 80-year-old man wearing a neatly pressed gray suit, a simple navy tie, polished black shoes, and a worn leather briefcase. Resting beside an old walnut walking cane, most people assumed he was just another retired citizen observing the trial. A young attorney even asked if he needed help finding the correct courtroom. The old man smiled politely and quietly replied, "No, thank you. I've spent enough years in rooms like this." No one paid him any further attention. Moments later, the courtroom doors opened, and Chief Justice Rebecca Collins entered. Before taking her seat, she suddenly stopped, looked toward the back of the courtroom, and immediately walked down from the bench. In complete silence, every lawyer, court officer, and spectator watched as the Chief Justice extended both hands to the elderly visitor. "Judge Richard Harrison," she said with unmistakable respect, "it's an honor to welcome you back." The room fell completely silent. Only then did everyone realize the quiet old man sitting alone in the last row was the legendary retired judge, whose landmark decisions decades earlier had permanently reshaped California's judicial system. Resting inside his worn leather briefcase was a collection of handwritten case notes spanning 40 years on the bench, along with one sealed letter left by the mentor who had taught him that the greatest judges are remembered not for the power they hold, but for the fairness they leave behind. The marble hallways of the Sacramento Superior Court were unusually busy, as reporters, attorneys, court officers, and spectators gathered for one of the most closely watched corruption trials in California that year. Television crews prepared their cameras outside the courtroom, while legal analysts discussed possible outcomes long before the first witness would be called. Everyone's attention was fixed on the famous attorneys and the high-profile defendant. Almost no one noticed the elderly man who quietly entered through the side door carrying a worn leather briefcase in one hand and leaning lightly on a polished walnut walking cane with the other. He was 80 years old, dressed in a neatly pressed gray suit, a simple navy tie, and polished black shoes that had clearly been cared for over many years. Instead of sitting near the front where legal observers usually gathered, he chose the last row of the courtroom beside the wall, placing his briefcase carefully beneath the bench before quietly looking toward the empty judge's seat. A young associate attorney hurrying past noticed him sitting alone. Believing the old man had wandered into the wrong courtroom, she smiled politely and approached. "Excuse me, sir," she said kindly. "This is a restricted hearing with very limited seating. Are you here for someone?" The elderly man returned her smile. "No," he answered gently. "I'm simply here to listen." The attorney glanced toward his walking cane. "If you're looking for the public gallery, I can help you find it." He shook his head softly. "Thank you, but I've spent enough of my life in courtrooms to know where I'd like to sit." Assuming he was merely a retired citizen interested in the case, she nodded politely before returning to her colleagues. Nearby, two younger lawyers quietly exchanged amused smiles. "Poor guy probably thinks this is open court." Another shrugged. "At least he's early." The old man heard every word but never reacted. Instead, he opened his weathered leather briefcase, just enough to remove a pair of reading glasses and a small notebook, whose edges had yellowed with age. He wrote today's date at the top of a blank page before closing it again. Minutes later, the courtroom doors opened. Bailiffs announced the arrival of Chief Justice Rebecca Collins, who had come to observe part of the proceedings because of the case's unusual public importance. Everyone immediately stood as she entered. Before reaching the bench, however, Rebecca suddenly stopped walking. Her eyes had fallen upon the elderly man, sitting quietly in the final row. For a brief moment, her serious expression softened into one of genuine surprise. Without hesitation, she stepped away from the front of the courtroom and walked directly toward him. The entire room watched in puzzled silence. Reaching the last row, Rebecca extended both hands warmly. "Judge Harrison," she said with unmistakable respect. "I didn't know you were coming today." The elderly man smiled. "Neither did I until this morning." Rebecca laughed softly before helping him to his feet. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, turning toward the courtroom, "allow me to introduce the Honorable Richard Harrison." The room became perfectly silent. Several senior attorneys immediately recognized the name. Younger lawyers looked around in confusion, until one whispered in disbelief, "Judge Harrison." "The Harrison?" Another quietly nodded. The youngest chief trial judge in state history. Reporters hurriedly searched their archives while court clerks exchanged astonished glances. The quiet old man sitting alone in the back row was no ordinary visitor. For nearly 4 decades, Richard Harrison had presided over some of California's most influential criminal and constitutional cases, writing opinions that permanently changed courtroom procedures across the state. Many of the legal protections now considered standard practice had first appeared in judgments bearing his signature. Rebecca gently picked up the worn leather briefcase resting beneath his seat. "May I?" she asked. Richard smiled and nodded. As she placed it on the bench, the old brass clasp accidentally slipped open. Several neatly organized notebooks became visible inside, each carefully labeled with handwritten years stretching back almost 40 years. Resting beneath them lay a single sealed envelope addressed in elegant blue ink. Across the front were only a few words. "For Richard, open this." When someone finally understands what it truly means to judge, a quiet murmur spread through the courtroom as Chief Justice Rebecca Collins carefully closed the old leather briefcase and returned it to Richard Harrison. Reporters who had never expected the morning to become a history lesson quickly began searching legal archives on their laptops. Younger attorneys whispered to senior partners, asking why everyone suddenly seemed so respectful toward the quiet elderly man who had entered unnoticed only minutes earlier. Rebecca smiled as she looked around the room. "Many of you recognize Judge Harrison's name," she said, "but I suspect very few of you realize how much of your daily work exists because of him." Complete silence followed. She turned toward the younger lawyers, seated behind the prosecution table. Every time a defendant receives additional time to review newly discovered evidence before trial, she paused. "You are following the Harrison standard." She looked toward another group. "Every time a judge requires prosecutors to disclose evidence that could help the defense, instead of only evidence that supports the state's case." She smiled. "You are following a procedure Judge Harrison fought to establish decades ago." Several experienced attorneys quietly nodded. Rebecca continued. "The courtroom recording system you all take for granted today, expanded legal aid protections for low-income defendants, clearer jury instructions, and standardized witness identification procedures all carry Judge Harrison's influence somewhere in their history." One young prosecutor stared in disbelief. "I learned all of those in law school." Rebecca nodded gently. "So did I." Richard smiled modestly. "No judge changes the law alone." Rebecca looked at him with admiration. "No," she agreed, "but sometimes one judge has the courage to ask the question everyone else avoids." A legal reporter cautiously raised her hand. "Your Honor, if Judge Harrison's decisions were so important, why has no one here ever met him?" Richard chuckled softly before answering. "Because retirement is supposed to be quieter than the courtroom." Gentle laughter spread through the room. Rebecca reached into the briefcase and carefully removed one of the oldest notebooks. "May I show them?" Richard nodded. She opened the first page. Instead of legal arguments, statutes, or case numbers, every notebook began with exactly the same handwritten sentence: "Before deciding who is right, make certain you understand who is being heard." The courtroom grew silent again. Rebecca slowly turned another page. Each case contained careful notes written entirely in Richard's own hand. Beside witness testimony, he had written questions rather than conclusions. "What am I missing? Would this seem different from the other side?" "Justice delayed is harmful. Justice rushed is dangerous," one law student sitting in the gallery whispered. He questioned himself in every case. Rebecca smiled. "That," she said quietly, "was exactly his strength." Richard gently accepted the notebook back into his hands. "A judge who stops questioning himself," he said softly, "usually begins making decisions for the wrong reasons." At that moment, the courtroom doors quietly opened once again. An elderly man wearing a military veteran's cap stepped inside carrying a small wooden box. The bailiff moved toward him, but Chief Justice Rebecca immediately recognized the visitor. "Please," she said warmly, "let him come forward." The veteran approached Richard with a broad smile before placing the wooden box into his hands. "I promised I'd return this one day," he said. Richard looked surprised. He slowly opened the lid. Inside rested an old brass nameplate, engraved with the words, "Judge Richard Harrison, Courtroom 3. Beneath it lay a faded newspaper clipping from more than 30 years earlier, showing Richard leaving the courthouse after issuing the controversial ruling that would later become known as one of the most important judicial decisions in California's modern legal history. Tucked beneath the clipping was another sealed envelope, written in the same elegant blue handwriting as the first. Across the front were only a few words. "For the day you finally understand that the robe never made you a judge." The courtroom remained completely silent as Richard Harrison slowly lifted the faded newspaper clipping from the wooden box. Across the front page was a photograph taken more than 30 years earlier, showing a much younger Judge Harrison walking down the courthouse steps surrounded by reporters. The headline read, "Judge faces public outrage after controversial ruling." Several younger attorneys exchanged puzzled looks. They had expected to see a celebrated victory, not a decision that had once made statewide headlines for all the wrong reasons. Chief Justice Rebecca Collins smiled gently. "Most people remember the criticism," she said. "History remembers the courage." She turned toward the audience. 32 years ago, Judge Harrison presided over a criminal case that seemed simple. Every piece of evidence appeared to point toward the defendant. Public opinion demanded a quick conviction. Newspapers had already declared him guilty before the trial even began. Richard quietly lowered his eyes, remembering the courtroom exactly as it had been. Rebecca continued. During the trial, Judge Harrison noticed one inconsistency that almost everyone else dismissed. A witness had changed only 3 words in a statement. She paused. Most people considered it insignificant. She looked toward Richard. He did not. Richard smiled faintly. 3 words can change an entire life. The courtroom remained silent. Rebecca nodded. Instead of rushing to judgment, he ordered additional evidence to be examined, delayed the verdict despite enormous political pressure, and faced weeks of public criticism for slowing the process. One of the younger prosecutors quietly asked, "What happened?" Rebecca looked toward him. The new investigation uncovered evidence, proving the defendant was completely innocent. A wave of surprise moved through the room. The real offender was arrested several months later. Richard gently placed the newspaper clipping back into the wooden box. The public eventually called it one of California's greatest judicial decisions. He smiled softly. At the time, he looked around the courtroom. Almost everyone thought it was my greatest mistake. No one spoke. The lesson required no further explanation. The elderly veteran who had returned the wooden box quietly stepped forward. "Your Honor," he said, "I was that defendant." Every head in the courtroom turned toward him. Tears filled the old man's eyes. "I lost nearly a year of my life waiting for the truth." He looked directly at Richard. "But because you refused to hurry, I didn't lose the rest of it." The courtroom sat in complete silence. Even the reporters stopped writing. The veteran reached into his jacket pocket and carefully removed a faded photograph. It showed a young family standing together outside the courthouse decades earlier. "You once told me something," he said with a smile. "You said a judge doesn't exist to finish cases quickly." He looked down at the photograph. "A judge exists to finish them correctly." Richard quietly nodded. "I remember." Chief Justice Rebecca Collins gently picked up the second sealed envelope resting inside the wooden box. "Judge Harrison," she asked softly, "would today be the right day?" Richard looked at the familiar handwriting for a long moment before giving a small nod. Rebecca carefully handed him the envelope. Written across the front in elegant blue ink were the words, "For the day you finally understand that justice is measured not by the speed of a verdict, but by the number of lives protected because you were willing to wait for the truth." Richard slowly opened the envelope as the entire courtroom watched in complete silence, knowing they were about to hear the final lesson left behind by the mentor who had shaped one of the most respected judges in the history of California. Richard Harrison carefully unfolded the yellowed pages inside the envelope while the courtroom remained completely silent. Even the reporters lowered their cameras as the retired judge adjusted his glasses and began reading the familiar handwriting aloud. "Dear Richard, if you are opening this letter, then you have finally discovered what every judge spends a lifetime trying to understand." He paused briefly before continuing. "People will remember the cases you win, the headlines you create, and the powerful people who stand before your bench. Forget all of that. None of it is your true responsibility." Every person in the courtroom listened without moving. Richard turned the page. "Your duty is not to prove that you are intelligent. It is not to become popular. It is not even to finish every case quickly. Your only duty is to protect the innocent, hold the guilty accountable, and never allow pride to become louder than truth." Several young attorneys quietly lowered their eyes. Richard continued reading. There will be days when everyone in the courtroom believes they already know the answer. Those will be the most dangerous days of your career. When certainty arrives too early, wisdom usually leaves through another door. Chief Justice Rebecca Collins smiled softly. He sounds exactly like you. Richard shook his head with a gentle smile. No, he replied. If I've ever sounded wise, it's only because I spent 40 years repeating his words. He unfolded the final page. One day, younger judges will ask how to become respected. Tell them not to chase respect. Chase fairness. Respect always arrives later. He paused before reading the last paragraph. Remember this, above everything else. The robe does not create justice. It only reminds the person wearing it that justice must always be greater than the person. Richard slowly folded the letter and returned it to the envelope. The courtroom remained silent for several long moments before anyone spoke. Finally, Chief Justice Rebecca Collins stepped toward the bench and carefully removed her own judicial robe. She walked back down the aisle until she stood beside Richard. Holding the robe with both hands, she said quietly, "Judge Harrison, every judge in this courthouse inherited a system you helped build." She smiled with deep respect. "Today, I'd like every young lawyer here to remember that before any title, any office, or any authority, there was simply a man who never stopped asking whether he had heard the whole truth." She then turned toward the courtroom. One by one, every judge present quietly stood, without a word. Each removed their robe and folded it across the back of their chair. The symbolism was immediately understood by everyone in the room. For a few powerful moments, they stood not as judges above others, but as servants of the law equal before the responsibility they all carried. The elderly veteran who had once been falsely accused stepped forward again and placed the old brass nameplate from Courtroom 3 into Richard's hands. "This belonged on your bench," he said softly. Richard smiled warmly before shaking his head. "No." He gently placed the nameplate onto the empty judge's bench instead. "It belongs to whoever sits there next." Chief Justice Rebecca Collins then uncovered a polished walnut display case that had quietly been prepared near the entrance of the courtroom. Inside rested Richard Harrison's first judicial robe, the worn leather briefcase, 40 years of handwritten case notebooks, the brass nameplate from Courtroom 3, and the 2 letters from his mentor. Above them, engraved in bronze, were the words, "The Richard Harrison Judicial Legacy," dedicated to the judge who taught generations that justice begins the moment we become willing to question our own certainty. As the courtroom rose together in a long and heartfelt standing ovation, it became clear that the greatest decision Richard Harrison had ever made was not a single famous ruling. It was choosing, every day for 40 years, to let humility guide the search for truth before authority ever delivered judgment. In the months following that unforgettable morning, the story of Judge Richard Harrison spread through law schools, courthouses, and judicial conferences across the United States. What began as the unexpected appearance of a quiet, elderly man sitting alone in the back of a courtroom soon became a powerful reminder of what the law was always meant to protect. Newspapers no longer described him simply as the retired judge who had changed California's judicial history. They called him the man who never allowed certainty to arrive before the truth. A year later, the California Judicial Council invited Richard to address every newly appointed judge in the state during their official judicial orientation. Hundreds of judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, law professors, and judicial clerks gathered inside the State Judicial Conference Hall, expecting a lecture on constitutional law or landmark legal decisions. Instead, Richard walked onto the stage, carrying only his worn leather briefcase. He slowly opened it and removed the oldest of his handwritten notebooks. Looking across the silent audience, he smiled gently before reading the first sentence written inside more than 40 years earlier. "Before deciding who is right, make certain you understand who is being heard." He quietly closed the notebook again. "People often ask me what the most important case of my career was," he began. "The truth is," he paused for a moment, "I never knew while I was hearing it." The audience listened without moving. Every person who entered my courtroom believed their case was the most important day of their life. He looked around the room. "For me, it was one more file." His voice softened. "For them, it was their future." Complete silence filled the hall. Richard continued, "The greatest danger facing a judge is not corruption." He gently rested his hand on the notebook. "It is becoming so confident in your own experience that you stop asking whether you've missed something." Chief Justice Rebecca Collins, seated in the front row, quietly smiled. She had heard those words before, but they carried even greater meaning now. At the conclusion of the ceremony, the California Judicial Council unveiled the Richard Harrison Judicial Learning Center. Established inside the state's Judicial Education Academy, preserved beneath glass were his gray courtroom suit, walnut walking cane, worn leather briefcase, 40 years of handwritten case notebooks, the brass nameplate from Courtroom 3, and the 2 letters written by his mentor. Visitors expected the first display to contain one of Judge Harrison's famous legal opinions. Instead, they found a single handwritten question displayed alone beneath soft lighting. What have I not yet understood? Every newly appointed judge entering the academy began their education there before attending a single lecture on statutes, procedures, or constitutional law. They were asked to stand silently before that question for several minutes, before opening their first law book. Years later, after Richard Harrison peacefully passed away at the age of 94, judges from across California gathered for a memorial unlike any held before. There were no speeches celebrating power, prestige, or famous verdicts. Instead, one by one, judges quietly placed handwritten notebooks beside his portrait, each promising to continue asking themselves the same question Richard had written before every case throughout his career. Above the entrance to the Richard Harrison Judicial Learning Center, a bronze inscription welcomed every future judge with the words that would define his legacy forever. The law grants authority, character decides how it will be used. Wisdom begins the moment a judge becomes willing to question himself before judging anyone else. Those who visited the center often admired the old briefcase, the worn notebooks, and the letters that had shaped one extraordinary career. But those who truly understood Richard Harrison's life realized that his greatest legacy had never been a famous ruling or a historic legal reform. It was teaching generations of judges that justice is never protected by the power of the bench alone. It is protected every single day by the humility, patience, and courage of the person who chooses to sit behind it. The story of Judge Richard Harrison soon spread far beyond California. At first, newspapers described the touching moment when the Chief Justice stepped down from the bench to greet an elderly visitor sitting quietly in the last row of a courtroom. But as people discovered who that visitor truly was, the story became something much greater than the return of a legendary retired judge. It became a reminder that the greatest legacy in the law is not measured by how many cases a judge decides, but by how many lives are protected because those decisions were made with wisdom, patience, and fairness. In the years that followed, law schools, judicial academies, and bar associations across the United States shared Richard Harrison's story with every new generation of lawyers and judges, not because of the titles he held, not because of the famous rulings he wrote, but because he demonstrated that true authority begins with humility rather than certainty. Whenever young judges asked him how to earn the respect of a courtroom, Richard always smiled before giving the same answer. "Never try to become the smartest person in the room," he would say. "Become the person most willing to keep listening." Several years later, during his final public appearance at the National Judicial Leadership Conference, Richard walked onto the stage carrying the same worn leather briefcase that had followed him through 4 decades on the bench. Instead of opening one of his famous case notebooks, he removed a single blank sheet of paper and held it up for the audience to see. Hundreds of judges, prosecutors, attorneys, and law students watched in complete silence. Richard smiled gently. "Every morning before court," he began, "I reminded myself that this page was still empty." He looked around the room. That meant I had not yet heard the evidence. He paused. I had not yet heard the witnesses. He smiled again. And most importantly, I had not yet earned the right to form an opinion. The auditorium remained perfectly still. Richard carefully placed the blank page back inside the briefcase. "The most dangerous moment for any judge," he continued, "is the moment he believes he already knows the answer before everyone has been heard." Before leaving the stage, he shared one final sentence that would later be engraved above the entrance of the Richard Harrison Judicial Learning Center. "Justice begins where certainty ends, and the search for truth continues." Years after Richard Harrison peacefully passed away, every newly appointed judge entering the California judicial system stopped before that inscription on the first day of training. Beside it rested his worn leather briefcase, the handwritten notebooks that had accompanied him through 40 years of service, the brass nameplate from Courtroom 3, and the 2 letters from the mentor who had taught him that the robe never made the judge, Visitors often admired the remarkable legal career those objects represented, but those who truly understood Richard Harrison's story realized that his greatest achievement had never been changing the law. His greatest achievement was changing the way generations of judges thought before applying it. Because laws can be written by legislators, amended by governments, and interpreted by courts. But justice survives only when the people entrusted with that responsibility remain humble enough to question themselves before judging anyone else. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson Richard Harrison left behind. A courtroom is never made honorable by its marble walls, its wooden bench, or the robe worn by the person presiding over it. It becomes honorable only when the person holding that authority remembers that every case is not simply another file on a desk, but another human life, waiting to be treated with fairness, dignity, and the courage to seek the whole truth before reaching a single conclusion.